Okay. We are happy to start. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. We have some important guests that came with us. The former President of the Czech Republic, Václav Klaus, former Prime Minister of Montenegro, Igor Lukic, former President of Tel Aviv University, and a top diplomat, Itamar Abinovic. Of course, winners of today's prize, Professor Magaloni from Stanford, scholars from many corners of the world, Russia, Israel, United States. And we are happy to start. This event is hosted by the Boris Institute at Tel Aviv University. The presence of Dr. Mintz is acknowledged, generous supporter of these activities. Every year we have such an event in a different university. This year we have chosen, and we are very thankful to Igor Lukic for helping us putting it together, to do it in this university. Now we have, the world is experiencing a very interesting, sometimes maybe scary period. We are all well aware of this. It started with the COVID, and then the Ukraine-Russian war, and then the Middle Eastern war, and we have some other conflicts looming. So this meeting that will start today with the acknowledgement of the Mintz Prize to Professor Magaloni, and then tomorrow we'll have a full day of discussions of some of the major challenges that are affecting our world right now. And I'm very happy to ask Dr. Sandra Tinai to give her blessing to the meeting. Well-established economist, leader of multiple different projects here and around Europe. We will start with you. Thank you so much.
Dear distinguished guests, partners, professors, and colleagues, good afternoon. First of all, I would like to welcome our guests who come from abroad to Montenegro and to University of Donja Gorica. It's my honor today that I address you on behalf of University of Donja Gorica. We are so delighted to be part of this conference, to co-organize with the Boris Mintz Institutes, to bring together so distinguished professors to discuss about significant, pressing, or urgently world challenges. This collaboration is more than just an academic exercise. It's a testament to our shared commitment to addressing the most critical questions facing our world today. The topics of this conference, globalization, war and peace, and the challenges facing institutional governments, resonate deeply with the vision and mission of University of Donja Gorica. At the UDG, we engage the philosophy and mission, our student, responsible citizen of the global world. This vision compels us to look beyond individual and local concerns, to consider our responsibility not just to ourselves and our immediate area, but to the broader fabric of humanity. Such a global approach is implemented through a broad level of cooperation. We are a university that has strategic partnership with Arizona State. We also so intensify cooperate with the European universities on the European project, as well as China's initiatives and China University. The responsibility in our vision that I mentioned means it is a personal, to continually grow and learn. It is a social, to contribute to communities we belong to. And it's a global to act in ways that support a sustainable, just and peaceful world. This framework aligns naturally with the mission of the Boris Mintz Institute. Your focus on funding strategic responses to the global challenges echoes our belief that education is not simply a pathway to the knowledge, but a means to create solution that matters. As I review the agenda and diverse expertise gathered here, one thing becomes clear: we are at the crossroad in the history. Whether addressing the weaknesses of the globalization, redefining strategic for a peace, or confronting the internal crisis of governance, this conference highlights the urgent need for interdisciplinary collaboration and innovative thinking. The conflicts we face today expose the fragility of our system. These crises demand that we rethink our approaches. At UDG, we firmly believe that education must rise to this challenge by fostering critical thinking and also that I mentioned global responsibility. In this context, I'm pretty sure that we should answer on some questions related to the globalization, how we can return beliefs in freedom as the initial incentives through the social and economic development. War and peace, how do we create a system that puts stress on dialogue over conflict? Institutional governance, how we can rebuild trust and the resiliency in the public institutions. They are not abstract questions, they are realities that our students and graduates will face tomorrow, but we are sure today also. And this is where education must deliver. Education must not only prepare individuals for career, but equip them to tackle the complex problem of our time. At UDG, we teach our students that their actions, whether in business, politics, or research, must contribute to the healthier global ecosystem. This means fostering a mindset that sees beyond borders and disciplines. Our partnership with the Boris Mintz Institute on this conference is a natural extension of this philosophy. Together, we aim to encourage our students and also faculty exchange to share knowledge and perspectives, develop executive education programs that address leadership challenges in uncertain world, and above all, inspire the next generation to take bold and responsible action. I want to leave you with the thought that challenges we discuss here are significant but not hopeless. The same interrelation that has exposed our vulnerabilities also give us the power to collaborate and innovative. Let us use the conference not only as a platform for dialogue, but as a catalyst for action. Together, through education, research, and shared vision, we can create a future where responsibility, justice, and sustainability are not just ideals, but also realities. Thank you, and I look forward to insight and cooperation that we develop through this conference.
Thank you, Dr. Tinai. We are so grateful for your hospitality. Part of the purpose of these meetings that Dr. Mintz generously supports is to create effectively, as Dr. Tinai mentioned, collaborations between the universities we visit. This always follows after such meeting. And I'm very pleased to invite Professor Milad Shamir to be the next person to greet us. Professor Shamir is a Vice President of Tel Aviv University for International Affairs, responsible for all collaborations with different universities around the globe. And she is here with us partially because we have to give away the prize and we need a Vice President to do that, but also to work with us on possible ways to collaborate. Professor Shamir has been associated with many such efforts, a special program with the University of Columbia, She's also a member of several directory boards of journals and international organizations, and the former head of the U.S. Center at Tel Aviv University, also established to create collaboration with different American entities and to bring American scholars to Tel Aviv, just as we came today here. We invite and host many scholars from around the globe. We will hopefully create some clear path forward for collaboration. Professor Shamir.
Thank you so much, Professor Sened, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really an honor to be in this distinguished company. And I feel privileged to be able to greet you on behalf of Tel Aviv University, who is a partner in this conference. So I will begin by echoing Professor Sened in expressing my sincere thanks to our partners at the University of Donja, Gorica, especially Professor Vukotic and Dr. Tinai. I was very impressed by the speech we just heard, and I feel that your support for this conference and your hospitality not only were able to bring this venture to life, but also really signal or mark the beginning of a new chapter in the relations between the institutions, and I very much share the value that you expressed on behalf of your university, and I believe that we are destined to create some good things together. I would also like to convey my deep appreciation and gratitude to Dr. Boris Mintz for his visionary leadership and his steadfast commitment to promoting conversation and seeking solutions to the most critical challenges of our time. It's really an inspiration, Dr. Mintz. Special thanks, of course, to Professor Itai Sened, my good friend, whose energy and foresight continue to shape these annual conferences into meetings that are impactful and meaningful. And thanks also to Professor Itamar Rabinovich, who contributes from his perspective of vast experience and international connections for the success of the Boris Mintz Institute. And of course, thank you to the whole team, to Peter at Tel Aviv University, whose meticulous organization and attention to detail have made our being here possible. And again, we're very, very happy to be here. It's my first visit to Montenegro, and I'm truly excited. This year, we are especially honored because we're celebrating the remarkable contribution of Professor Beatrice Magaloni, the recipient of the Boris Mintz Institute Award. Her groundbreaking work exemplifies the power of academia to address global challenges, such as poverty, violence, and the erosion of human rights. Professor Magaloni, your research inspires us all and reminds us of the profound responsibility that we hold as academics in this world. And indeed, this is something I would like to say a few words about, because at the present time, as the drums of war seem to beat louder and louder, the role of academics becomes even more pressing. It is up to us to uncover the deep roots of conflicts, to find ways to minimize destruction, to minimize human suffering, and to use the tools of innovation and inquiry to point our leaders towards resolution, even when these leaders have sometimes apparently given up hopes for peace. Ironically, just when the world seems to need academics the most, we are witnessing the systematic vilification and targeting of academic institutions by some regimes around the world, some populist regimes that sometimes portray universities as enemies of the people and use their platforms to undermine trust in scholarly expertise and in intellectual freedom. This dynamic is playing out across the globe. What happened to higher education in places like Turkey and Hungary is unfortunately already an old story. But now in the United States, President-elect Trump repeatedly attacks universities, and his soon-to-be vice president has branded them the enemy. In Russia, Putin's government is eroding academic freedom, suppressing critical research, and turning universities into tools of state propaganda. And in my country of Israel, universities are increasingly under fire from the governing coalition, who promotes tirelessly and insistently legislation aimed to silence academic voices. Against this rising sentiment, it is essential that we as academics stand together across national borders. Sometimes it seems that we're the only ones who fully understand the crucial importance of what we do and who see the price the entire world will pay if universities are weakened. Our greatest strength lies in our ability to create networks of cooperation and solidarity that reinforce our research and defy the forces trying to divide us. This is why there's no greater mistake, I think, that we can make at this time than indulging in a mutual silencing or promoting a culture of boycotts. Let's not be so foolish as to do the work for those who seek to undermine us. Academic creativity, innovation, and collaboration are nothing less than humanity's hope for a better future. If our societies fail to recognize this, then it falls on us to make the case boldly, together, and with an unwavering commitment to our shared values. And as I said in the beginning of my words, we seem to share these values in this room very much so. So thank you everyone for your presence here today. I hope we can make this meeting a meaningful step towards creating new alliances and new ideas. A small step maybe, but one that joins others to help us navigate these turbulent times. I wish us all a productive and inspiring conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Millet. Professor Shamir will elaborate on this issue of cross boycotts and silencing universities tomorrow at a special discussion that she will have in one of the panels. I'm very grateful to invite Dr. Mintz. Dr. Boris Mintz has been a huge benefactor of the arts and the sciences throughout his life. He has been a huge supporter of Tel Aviv University and the Boris Mintz Institute in particular, working tirelessly to bring different universities in different corners of the world together in such events as we are experiencing today. These events would not be possible, would not even be imaginable if it wasn't for his tireless effort to bring us together time and again and again and again, and making sure that I and all of my team are doing our job at promoting this incredible set of values that he's supporting in his support of the arts and the sciences. So, Dr. Mintz, thank you.
Good evening. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad to welcome you, and I want to express my deep gratitude to you for finding the opportunity to participate in our conference. First of all, I would like to express very close. Closer. First of all, I would like to express my appreciation of Professor Veselin Viketic, Melissa Viketic, Igor Lukšić, Itai Senate. Thank you to the efforts, and we are opening our conference today. I also want to welcome and thank two historical figures, President Václav Klaus and Ambassador Itamar Rabinovich, for participating in the conference. My thanks to the leadership to Tel Aviv University for the constant support to the Institute's activities. Professor Melita Shamir, who has already welcomed us today. Today we are going through the darkest period in modern history, a period when the weakness and inefficiency of international and national management systems and institutions leads to catastrophic consequence for the human population. Already during the COVID-19 period, problems in management system from the municipal to the international level were obvious. The war unleashed by Putin's Russia in Ukraine, as well as escalation in the Middle East provoked by the Hamas terrorism organization of October 7, 2023, has revealed new gaps in management system that are global in nature. Our conference aims explore various aspects of this grim reality. We need to propose new institutional solutions that are vital for creating a global ecosystem suitable for human life in the future. In just a few minutes, we will welcome to the winner to be BMI 2024 award, Professor Beatrice Magaloni, from Stanford University. The MBI award was awarded by Professor Magaloni for her contribution to the study of authoritarianism and its return as a global problem. Today, her work is considered a classic of this field. The theory developed in her work sets the agenda for the conceptualization of multi-party autocracies, which have become the most common form of dictatorship worldwide. Her work also provides insight into the most insidious threats to democracy in the modern period, which come not from military coups, but from the civilian leaders who come to power as a result of elections. I am very glad, dear Professor Magaloni, we have the opportunity to present you with a well-deserved award and listen to your insightful keynote address. Thank you so much.
I would like to invite Professor Shamir, the Vice President of Tel Aviv University, together with Boris Mintz and, of course, Professor Magaloni, to receive the prize ceremonially here in Montenegro, of all places. Thank you so much for hosting this important prize. Professor Magaloni? After receiving the prize, Professor Magaloni will discuss her work and gives a keynote speech on precisely the issue of the rise of authoritarian regimes in modern Europe. The floor is yours, please.
Sorry, can I play your presentation?
Yes, please. I want to begin by thanking the Boris Means Institute and Mr. Boris Means for his vision in creating this institute for solving the most critical problems we face in humanity. I also want to thank the Tel Aviv University and especially Professor Etai for all his graciousness in how he has brought me to Montenegro to receive this prestigious award. I was nominated for the award and received it in May at a moment where the war in Israel with Gaza was escalating, and I felt that it was not a moment to celebrate. As there is not a ceasefire and things have been escalated, we all decided that it was really a good moment to come to a state in Montenegro that recognizes Palestine as a state. And I only wish to reiterate my conviction that the sooner the war ends, the more possibilities are that these two great nations can live next to each other. So I want to begin by saying that I appreciate Montenegro and the university for bringing us here to honor this work that I have been doing, and also to join all the voices around the world who are fighting against autocracy. So I'm going to begin by presenting some of my work on authoritarian regimes. I was asked to speak for about 1 hour. Is that okay? But I also can shorten it or lengthen it as you please. So I'm going to talk about autocracies and elections in a world of democratic decline. What do these men have in common? I don't have to mention who these men are. Most of you know them. Maybe you don't know. On that side, it was the former president of Mexico, Manuel López Obrador, Robert Mugabe, and then Maduro, and then President of El Salvador. The rest of you know Putin and Mr. Trump. What do they have in common? They have a commitment to aggrandizing executive power at the expense of checks and balances upheld by independent democratic institutions. They all arrived to the presidency through the electoral process. These leaders are personifications of a wider global trend of democratic backsliding. They rely on a set of interdependent and mutually reinforcing strategies with the same goal: consolidating and centralizing power. While these tactics might seem idiosyncratic and personality-driven, there is a logic to autocratization. In other terms, there is a playbook we need to understand to mitigate the global risk of democratic backsliding. I argue that many of these modern autocracies weaponize the instruments of democracy to undermine democracy. Guns and soldiers are no longer the main threats to democracy, but civilian leaders elected in multi-party elections. Although highly visible in recent years, autocracies that hold multi-party elections have emerged as the dominant form of autocracy since the end of the Cold War. Here the dream of these regimes is to reap the fruits of democratic legitimacy without running the risks of democratic uncertainty. But how do they do this? I'm going to talk about this, answer this question in this talk, hopefully. First, I'm going to talk about how we understand autocracies and how we classify these regimes. Then I will talk about the global trends in democracies and autocracies today. I will talk a little bit about how democracies die. And then I will move to the rise of electoral authoritarian regimes and to unpack what is the autocracy's playbook in these regimes. And then I would end by talking about the fight for democracy today and what are some of the lessons that my work shows. This is a graphic of data that I have been collecting on understanding and classifying democracies around the world. The gray area is autocracies, and I will unpack that in a minute. But what you can see is on top are the number of countries in the world since 1950 until 2024 that are democratic. So if you look at the world that way, you can see two important trends. One is that in the 1970s to more or less around the 1980s, the dominant form of regime in the world was an autocracy. Then we see what is called the third wave of democratization, when democracy begins to expand around the world. And that is really very optimistic era. And more or less when we reach 2010, there is no more democratization happening around the world. So if we only look at these two regimes, we really don't understand what is happening within the world of autocracies. So what I have done is classify these regimes. I have followed a great deal of literature in political science that studies variation among autocratic regimes. And then I'm going to focus on this particular form of autocracy that holds multi-party elections and still is an autocracy. So first, how do we define democracy? Democracy simply, in the way I'm classifying, is defined as a system where there are multiple competitive parties, where elections are used to select leaders, and the executive is institutionally constrained or checked by other parts of government. Here, I want to mention that there is a distinction done in political science between electoral democracy, that simply means where there are elections in a regime, and liberal democracy, where there are respects for human rights and there are checks and balances. But then, how do we unpack authoritarian regimes? There are many forms of autocracies. Military regimes, here I define them as places where the military has effective control over both political leadership and state policy. Then there are single-party regimes. All politics is conducted within the banner of one single party, and usually that party prohibits in the constitution the existence of other political parties that can challenge them. So, for example, communist regimes are characteristic of single party. And then it comes electoral authoritarian regimes. Here, the single party, which has been a dominant party, recognizes the existence of other parties that can legally challenge that party in elections. And the problem, and what differentiates this from democracies, is that generally they lack checks and balances. An alternation of political power in these regimes is no longer a natural outcome of elections. Finally, we have monarchies. There are still monarchies in the world. They remain very stable regimes. And here I'm not going to focus at all on this, but there are regimes where the dictator is selected among the members of a royal or dynastic family in charge of making the principal decisions. I'm not going to talk about these regimes. Obviously, there are democracies where there is still a monarchy, but I'm not. We classify them as democracies. It is very difficult to code these differences using data for the entire world. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about the difficulties of measurement. So some scholars, to distinguish between electoral autocracies and democracies, focus on what they call free and fair elections. And then the difficulty is really how do we code when an election is free and fair? And it is not a very simple thing to do. Consider regimes where there are accusations of electoral fraud, but there is no real fraud. So the previous presidential election in the United States, where Trump claimed that there was fraud against him, well, if we were observants from outside, we would say, okay, this is a regime where there are no clean elections. So the problem is that around the world, we observe a lot of challengers saying there are fraudulent elections. So that is not really an easy way to measure these differences. And another difficulty is in these regimes that I study, there is often the case that the incumbents are able to win with very large margins of victory, and they don't need to manufacture the vote. So fraud is not really the essence of these regimes, although they commit fraud, and I will talk about when they do that and how they can get away with it. Then there is other scholars who have been really thinking about this very hard. Adam Przeworski, who is one of the scholars I respect the most, thinking about democracy and autocracy, he thinks that democracy, he defines it as a system of institutionalized uncertainty. And for him, and I agree with him deeply, the essence of democracy is that incumbents lose power and they accept their defeats peacefully. That is the essence of democracy. So he tried to distinguish between democracies and autocracies by focusing precisely on this moment of alternation. If the incumbent loses the elections, would that incumbent cede power peacefully? And then that was the main definition that he followed, but then we have some very serious problems around the world. So think, for example, of the LDP in Japan, which ruled for over 3 decades. If you had been trying to understand whether Japan had been is a democracy or not at that moment, and you had been Adam Przeworski, you would need to classify Japan as an autocracy because there had not been alternation of political power in office. Another case is Botswana, for example. The BDP, which is the Botswana Democratic Party, was in power from 1966 until 2023. So it's a very long-lasting regime, and for most observers in Botswana, it seemed to be relatively democratic. But if you had been Przeworski before 2023, he wouldn't code Botswana as a democracy because it hadn't really passed that moment in which alternation was seen as the outcome of that regime. So we have many, many cases in which that distinction is very problematic, and since this is the regimes I study, I had to develop different ways in which to distinguish a democracy from an electoral autocracy. In my view, the line separating an electoral authoritarian regime from a democracy is when the balance of the system of checks and balances is undermined. The line separating these regimes is very tenuous, and often democracies die very gradually, often also with electoral support and without people noticing. So what is the moment in which we say this regime becomes an autocracy? And I would say is when there are these constitutional reforms that undermine checks and balances. So, for example, in Hungary in 2011, Viktor Orban enacted a constitutional reform that centralized power, undermined the independence of the judiciary, and largely institutionalized himself in power. In that moment, I would say that regime crossed the line. Similarly, in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez came to power in a democratic election. He won by a big margin. And in 1999, he called for a referendum convening a constitutional assembly to rewrite the constitution. That he won with 80% of the vote. Then he won the elections for the Constituent Assembly, taking 95% of the votes. And in that moment, he completely changed the institutional apparatus of the state. He undermined the independence of the judiciary, he concentrated power in the hands of the executive, and then he was able to re-elect himself until he died. So to me, that is the key distinction between a regime that is a democracy with elections and an autocracy with elections, the moment in which checks and balances are undermined. Okay, so I took the world and tried to come up with classification of the entire world and how does the world look today. So the data set goes from 1950 again to 2023. Democracy is the blue. As you could say, there is again a big spread in democracies around the world, with the third wave coming more or less around 1990. But then what you observe are really very important aspects here. One is that the green area, military regimes have significantly not disappeared, they are still there, but there is a significantly fewer number of military regimes around the world. Monarchies, as I mentioned, which is the black one, they remain very stable. And the two important aspects that we highlight here is the tremendous growth of electoral authoritarian regimes, which is the yellow area, and a reduction of single-party regimes. So this is the world we see today. If you see the world of autocracy today is mostly yellow, and that means that is electoral authoritarian. And these are the regimes that I study. This is more or less this is the way the world looks today. There are still some imprecisions in some classifications that I'm working, because I just updated this data set. I had done the data set until 2010, and with this lecture, I updated all the data to the present. So I'm still working on some of the cases. But as you could see, the world seems to be quite autocratic in the yellow part. Again, multi-electoral autocracy is very, very common in Africa. The cases in Latin America that I focus a lot, and I'll talk about that, is Venezuela, which was a long-lasting democracy that with Chavez and now with Maduro obviously became an incredibly authoritarian regime. Nicaragua is another case that Daniel Ortega began with elections, the love of the people, and then he completely undermined democracy. And then we observe a lot of, obviously, Russia, and a lot of the single-party regimes in Africa that instituted multi-party elections in the 90s. Many of them never lost the elections, but continue in power. And we observe a new wave, by the way, of military regimes that I'm not going to talk about in the Francophone Africa that just happened in the last 4 years. Okay, so as I mentioned, the main distinction between electoral autocracy and democracy has to do with the lack of judicial, the executive constraints by the judiciary and by the legislature. And here I'm just showing the data. The first column are judicial constraints, the second are legislative constraints, the share of the president's vote, and then the share of the incumbent's party seat in the lower chamber. And you could see the distinction I mentioned is very clear. Democracies have, the higher the number is the more judicial checks that executive faces. So in democracies, generally there is enough judicial checks on executive powers. And in the electoral autocracies is significantly lower. That is a very strong distinction. Similarly with legislative constraints, so what happens normally is that the party of the incumbent wins the overwhelming majority of seats in the legislature, and in that moment there are no constraints. There tends to be a lot of party discipline, and so if the executive is from one party, his or her party, normally it's his. I mean, there are very few actually dictators who are women in the world. Bangladesh's former dictator just was defeated, so that was the only woman I can really found in the data set in the last years. And so you see very strong legislative constraints in democracies, but not in electoral autocracies. And again, the presidential vote share and the legislative vote share are significantly larger. Normally they win with so overwhelming majorities that that's what allows them to destroy the institutions. And here is just measures of civil liberties and political liberties that different indexes have been constructing. And again, we can see the very distinction between the first row, which are democracies that have significantly higher civil liberties on the VDEM score. Then Freedom House is scored the opposite way, so the lower the number is the higher the freedom. That's counterintuitive in this second one. But again, democracies look very different to electoral autocracies. Also in political freedoms, again, it's reversed. So the lower the number, the higher the freedoms. and the polity score, which is, again, another very common way in which political scientists classify these regimes. The higher the score there, the more competition there is for power, the more checks and balances, the more alternation of political political power in office, and the more civil liberties. And we observe the higher the number, democracies are close to 8, and electoral autocracies are -7. That means that they are highly authoritarian. So there is something very different from having a democracy to an autocracy that holds elections. This is what is called a transition matrix that I just constructed. Maybe the letters are a little small for you to see, but what is really important to see here, so here you observe on this row, these are democracies, and then the column would say how many times a democracy falls to a military regime. So, for example, in the entire data set, democracies have fallen to a military regime 67% of the time. So that means that the biggest threat in the entire period has been the military, but I'll show you the differences in a moment. And then only 31 in the entire data set falling to an electoral autocracy. The matrix is also very interesting because it tells you, for example, if you are a military regime, what are the chances that you become a democracy? That's 43%. So a lot of military regimes happen in highly unstable democracies. So where the democracy comes and then it falls to the military, and the military comes again, that type of instability. And it also shows that military regimes transform into electoral autocracies. And at the end of the transition matrix, it's not really important at the moment to talk about that, but I'll talk more at the end of the talk, is that military regimes compared to electoral authoritarian regimes tend to be significantly less stable. So electoral autocracies are quite stable. They last a long time. I just want to, before I go into the theory, trying to explain this, that there is a lot of work on backsliding and how the world in general, not only in Africa or Asia or Latin America, but also in Europe, has experienced what political scientists call backsliding, and that means that democracies are weakening in general. This is a global trend. So this is the best measure produced by VDEM, which is a very important index that we have on how much these democracies are backsliding, and here are the numbers. So you observe, for example, in Europe there is a 5% decline in democracy, whereas in Latin America there is a 9% decline on average. But again, I want to emphasize backsliding, which is this weakening of democratic norms that we observe, for example, today in the United States very clearly, and I'll talk about that at the end of the talk. That doesn't mean that is an autocracy, okay? So the United States is experiencing a decline in the quality of its democracy because there is not the same consensus on norms, and there has been quite a bit of arbitrary behavior, especially on the part of Trump, but that doesn't mean that the system is no longer a democracy. So what we are talking about is really democratic collapses, when the regime is no longer distinguished as a democracy. So there are really clear geopolitical factors driving these falls of regimes. The fact that the military comes more often in some periods than electoral autocracy. So, for example, during the Cold War, the common form in which democracies fell was at the hands of the military. 80% of the democratic collapses in that period were military coups. And what happened then is what the United States and the Soviet Union sought to expand their influence by funding or directly intervening in support of military factions aligned with their ideological or geopolitical interests. So that was a very destructive period for democracy in general in the world, and that's when the world was most autocratic, as I showed you before. Studies have also shown why was there so lack of democracy in that period. There are many scholars arguing that the fall of democracy also has to do with state weakness, poverty, a frail middle class, limited civic engagement, and low literacy levels that make democracy unstable.
So particularly we see instability of democracy in poorer countries. That's something that the literature has established, and also, for example, periods of very serious macroeconomic instability, economic collapse, currency devaluations, joblessness, that are also associated with the military arriving to power. So this is how the world looks. A lot of military coups happening in South America, especially in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and then coups happening a lot in Africa as well. But I'm not going to talk about that. That's more of the period of the Cold War that I was talking about. But that doesn't mean that military is still not a danger to democracy. As I mentioned, there's been a recent wave of military coups in Africa. But what I'm going to focus is on this, democratic collapse at the hands of civilian leaders. And more or less after 2010, which is the moment in which this third wave of democratization halted, we observed that 56% of democracies have died at the hands of civilian leaders through elections. And the classical examples are, but of course they are not the only ones, it's Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, Peru under Fujimori, Turkey under Erdogan, Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega, Bangladesh under Sheikh Hasina, and Hungary under Viktor Orban. These are some of the very well-known cases of democratic collapse, not backsliding. And here again, I give you just the summary of how many regimes, democracies have fell to the military in the Cold War, 81%. During the third wave of democratization, fewer democracies fall still at the hands of the military, and now is the backsliding era. Most of democracies are falling to electoral autocracy. So how does these regimes emerge? The most common form of autocracy we see, where do they come from? And here are the paths that I have discovered in the data. One, a very common one, is coming from single-party regimes, meaning, for example, in many African countries, these regimes were established after decolonization. Often these movements brought very popular leaders to power, and once these leaders arrive to power, they undermine elections, and they remain in power for many, many years. But then there was this wave of democratization, and in the 90s, they introduced multi-party elections. And in a lot of these cases, for example, you see Tanzania, Gabon, Zimbabwe, after the introduction of elections, these regimes continue to hold power, the same, even with the same leader for years. So that's a very common way in which these regimes have emerged. The second is post-Soviet states. So in many of these, electoral autocracies emerge after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So, for example, Russia is a very clear case. Belarus, Azerbaijan, and all the rest of the countries that I mentioned here. Another way in which they arrive, less common, is directly from colonial rule. For example, the UMNO in Malaysia, Botswana that I just mentioned, Zimbabwe, and Guyana. And then from democracies, I mentioned the ones that Venezuela, Hungary, Turkey, Nicaragua, Bangladesh, and from military coups. Okay, this is the list of countries, and I'm not going to talk about them, just about the incredible longevity that we observe in some of these regimes. So the years, for example, in which here is Tanzania's party has been in power 60 years. Okay, so again, this is the pattern that we observe. And so now I'm going to explain some of the arguments that I made in my work to try to understand how do these regimes remain in power. What is the role of elections? Does it mean something that people have a voice with their votes? So in this book, I ask, how do autocracies manipulate these democratic tools and institutions to extend their hold on power? And what factors contribute to the resilience and collapse of these electoral authoritarian regimes? So here, I'm going to say that autocrats in general, not only in these electoral autocracies, use two broad strategies to remain in power. One is having loyalty, and the other is coercion. So loyalty, you need to remain in power from your ruling coalition. So if you have a military, you need to have the military on your side. Because if the military is not loyal to you, it's going to make a coup against you. Or there is a ruling party, the ruling party has to remain loyal to the dictator. So you need loyalty from the ruling elites. But I argue you also need loyalty from the masses. And that's part of the contribution of my work, has been to unpack why mass support gives so much strength to autocracies. And then, obviously, autocracies use coercion to stay in power. So they repress, eliminate, or intimidate opponents, or they quash mass protests and revolts. They also, in this case, I will show, use coercion, particularly the armed forces and the police, to enforce electoral fraud when they need it to stay in power. And there are other mechanisms that I won't discuss here of control, such as media control, censorship, surveillance, and propaganda, and those I won't discuss. And here in these two strategies that autocracies need to stay in power, loyalty and coercion, the more loyalty you have, the less coercion you need. When loyalty declines from the ruling elite or from the masses, then you need coercion. Most of the literature has emphasized that the main danger of autocracies doesn't come from the masses, it comes from the ruling elites. As I mentioned, again, the military, those who are, palace coups is the typical form in which dictators fall. But what I argue is that if you have mass support and you can mobilize the masses in your favor, you shield yourself very strongly against these divisions within the ruling elite. One is because the more mass support you have, the less you need the military and the coercive apparatus to enforce your rule. So you disempower the military, and in a way you could prove yourself because you don't empower the military that much. And that is something that having votes on your side allows you to do. The other is that the more people vote for you, the easier it is to deter factionalism within the ruling elite. So suppose I'm a really dominant hegemonic party that wins with 70, 80% of the vote. If I am an ambitious politician in that regime and really want to gain power, I'm not going to join the opposition, I'm going to join the hegemon. And so the fact that you are so powerful at the polls dissuades opponents to contest against you. And then, as I mentioned, once you have all this power or electoral mandates, you can really undo the institutions in your favor. So having mass support is really important for autocrats. But obviously, mobilizing voters is costly. So how do they do this? How do they gain support? And here I'm going to talk about a lot of the mechanisms that my work in the book that I mentioned and a lot of papers that I've written is how do they manage to gain support. One has to do with performance legitimacy. So obviously, if you deliver economic growth and you deliver jobs and you deliver benefits to supporters, supporters are going to be, endorsing you. Then I'll talk something about punishment. And this is a form of economic coercion that these autocrats use. And it's a very powerful tool, especially to trap the poor, to support autocratic regimes. Then I'm going to talk about how they change the institutions, a little bit about power sharing and how they manage to deter these elites from challenging them. And then at the end, I will finish with coercion as one of the strategies. So here, I'm not going to talk about this model, but in my work, I try to understand how voters evaluate a party that has been in power for many, many years versus an opposition that has never been in power. So normally, let's say a voter wants economic performance, wants jobs, to improve his or her livelihood. Then they have to evaluate how the incumbent would do relative to an opposition that has no record or poor record or very distant record in government. And I draw from this Bayesian framework that shows that the less you know about someone in the past, the more diffuse your priors are, and so the less you are going to really know what they do. So it's very risky for voters to vote for opponents that don't have a record in government. And on the other hand, if you only have seen a party governing for many generations, you have a big memory about how they've done in your life cycle, right? And so voters use these life cycles to understand how the incumbent is going to deliver in the future relative to this uncertain opponent. And so suppose that you have a regime that has delivered quite consistent economic growth, and then there is a sudden economic crisis. What the model shows is that voters can be quite forgiving to short-term economic crisis when you have this imbalance between incumbents that have been in power for so many years and risky opponents. So that's one prediction. They can be more tolerant for some bad economic performance. And the other is that, contrary to modernization theory, in political science, modernization theory says that the wealthier you become, the less likely is that you are going to sustain an autocratic regime. So a wealthy middle class brings democracies down. Basically, this is the classic formulation by Lipset. Also, more plurality, people who have more education, that would be less tolerant for autocracies. Well, this actually would say, well, if you deliver economic growth, actually that's going to help the autocracy. So it's really very contrary to modernization theory. And you could see here, this is coming from, again, VDEM, and this is World on Data. And just looking at the world in 1960, this is the democracy index. So the more you go to your right is the more democratic a system is. And here is the GDP per capita. And what you can see in the 1960s, it was a very clear pattern between being wealthier and being more democratic. And that was really what inspired modernization theory. So theorists thought wealthier countries are going to destroy autocracies. In that moment it made sense. Maybe the only exception was India, surprisingly. A quite poor country with a decent democracy. But then if you look at the world today, that relationship has disappeared. And so what you can see here is two important things. One is that there are systems, so for example, Senegal, Liberia, Malawi, Gambia, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, that are highly democratic, but they are not very wealthy. So that's one pattern in the data. There are a lot of new democracies that have been established in less wealthy, in poorer countries. But the most important thing is here, all the new, the autocracies that have become wealthier. So you observe, China is the best example. So China, delivering such high levels of economic growth and performance and expansion of the economy that has lifted so many million people out of poverty in very few generations, it's one explanation of why China remains so stable. It also tells us that China depends a lot on continuing to deliver that type of economic growth to remain in power. But you observe the same thing, for example, with Saudi Arabia, Russia itself, Turkey. They have become comparatively wealthy and very autocratic. Well, the latest elections in Turkey shows that the regime actually has been weakening quite substantially. The second, so one is economic performance. If you deliver, you are going to be more stable. But obviously, most autocracies don't deliver. We have a lot of autocracies that actually are quite poor at delivering economic growth. So how do they manage to mobilize voters? And this is what I call in my book the punishment regime. It's a very simple argument. So suppose that a voter has two alternatives. One is voting for the incumbent, which is in the upper, and then one is voting for the opposition. And then if the incumbent controls all the state resources, government programs, jobs, fertilizers, seeds for plotting the land, irrigation, the more the government controls, well, the more the government can really threaten anyone who goes to the opposition to punish them. And this is what I call economic coercion. So anyone who doesn't vote for me is not going to get the benefits that they require. And that is the punishment regime. So if the voter knows this and believes that the regime can see how she voted, and the voter is poor especially, it's going to be really hard for the voter to defect from the incumbent who controls all resources and vote for the opposition. So normally what this is going to happen is that it moves for the incumbent, and then at least that voter doesn't get punished. The incumbent clearly threatens to punish all those who defect from the party. And this is a really very perverse system of incentives that I trap the poor the most, supporting autocrats. And so let me just give you an example. I worked on land reform in Mexico, trying to apply this rule. Mexico maybe has conducted the most expansive land reform that has existed in the contemporary period. the land reform went from 1920 to 1991, and about 50% of Mexico's total arable land was given to approximately 3.5 million peasants in Mexico. The PRI began its rule more or less around 1929, and immediately they began with the expansion of land reform during 1934 with the 34 to 40 with a president called Lázaro Cárdenas. And he maybe had a vision that he wanted to give land in his native state of Michoacán to people, to peasants, because the land was highly concentrated, and maybe in that moment he had very good intentions, and that particular land reform that he did had good effects for those who received the land. But then, little by little, presidents in Mexico started to see how amazing this instrument was to gain the support of peasants. So they kept on giving land and land until 1991. And what they increasingly did is giving land of poorer and poorer quality. So in the end, in the period of 1970s, they started to give most desert land with very little value, but peasants really wanted the land. And often you had to wait for 10 years to get the land because you had to go through the governor, then there it arrived to the bureaucracy, and at the end the president directly had to certify the land that was given to peasants. So this system trapped peasants in the hands of the PRI, and the peasants became the most solid supporters of the PRI, and tragically, they never were lifted out of poverty. The way that the land reform was designed was to keep collective land holdings. Peasants could not sell it, they could not really rent it, or if they did, it had to be in an informal manner. So if you go to Mexico, it's really a tragic, because there was all these policies that the government implemented while the people remained poor. That's why I call this is a very tragic and brilliant. Tragic from the point of view of voters, but brilliant from the point of view of the regime, that they were really trapped in the hands of the regime. And what I show here is, so if you have, this is the support for the party. So the higher the levels, the more support. And these are two very interesting results from my work. One is that the higher income of the voter, so voters who are wealthier, support less the PRI. So the middle class, for example, was the first to defect against the PRI. So in the long term, for the PRI, having wealth was bad because voters started to defect from the PRI. So there was some interest in keeping a very solid base of support of voters poor. But if they brought economic growth, which is that one, in the short term, they would reward the party. So this is something that that I call tragic and brilliant, because there is an interest in keeping these voters poor. So obviously to know who is your supporter and who is your opponent, you need a very strong organization that can really identify loyal voters from those who defect. And for that purpose, you have these very dense party organizations that penetrate and control society. So they enter in many aspects of society. I mean, not to the extent that communist regimes could do it, but in similar fashion, they can institute these ways of brokering with voters so that there is deep local knowledge, so that you can make this distinction between opponents and supporters. So let me give you two examples of how this theory travels beyond Mexico, and it's, again, very tragic and brilliant. So Chávez, in Venezuela, he came to power because there was massive dissatisfaction with democracy. The system of, two-party system had massively failed the poor, and there was the sense that it hadn't given them voice, and they didn't have any share in the process of wealth creation. There was big inequalities, and so Chávez profited from this and earned big levels of support. When he came to power, there was a very amazing oil boom. Venezuela is very highly dependent on oil, and he was able to institute very massive social programs called Las Misiones Bolivarianas, where he expanded social programs. And then he had exactly the strategy that I mentioned, which is I call the punishment regime. And there is this even very interesting, fascinating study in which there is a recall that voters called Chávez in a recall, and then he's able to get the list of people who voted against him. And it's called the My Santa list. So they have exactly the names of all the voters who were against Chavez, and Chavez distributed that list among his bureaucracies. And then there is this article that took all the data and was able to demonstrate that if you were in that list, you would drop by a 5% in earnings and a 1.3% point in employment rates. So that's the way the punishment regime works. You have to know who is voting against you and then using that information in your favor to punish voters. So if you are a poor voter in Venezuela, you are going to really have a hard time defecting Chavez, right? The cost of defecting are very, very high, and so again, wealthier voters are going to be able to defect, and I call this make an ideological investment in democracy. That requires some wealth to be able to do that. And then what happens in Venezuela? Well, Chavez dies, and then Maduro, sorry, the picture is very small. This is the recent elections. This is one of the big heroines of democracy today, Maria Corina Machado. I'll talk more about her, fighting authoritarianism in Venezuela. But what happened? The President Maduro, he comes now, a deep economic collapse in Venezuela. The GDP shrank by roughly 3/4 between 2014 and 2021. There is rampant hyperinflation, contributing to scarcity of basic goods such as food and medicine. Again, the oil is very dependent on oil. Venezuela, there is a plunge on the barrel prices, and that is in part what is also driving the economic difficulties, but also economic mismanagement and corruption. And now every single democratic institution in Venezuela, because Chavez modified the constitution, he undermined the independence of the court. Now he doesn't have the support of the people, and Maduro is there in power, so he has undermined every single democratic institution, but has increasingly relied on repression, state terror to stay in power. And what has happened is a massive exodus of people. A fourth of the population has fled Venezuela because of authoritarianism. Obviously, Maduro no longer relies on mass support, and I'll talk about the elections, the recent elections, but he relies deeply on coercion to stay in power. But he was able to get there because Chavez built that mass of support and then distorted the institutions in the way that he did. So now I'm going to talk about this. How do they do this distorting of institutions with another example? So normally what these regimes strive to is to get the supermajority necessary to be able to change the constitution. So it depends on the rules of the game. For example, in Mexico, I don't now even now recall, it was above 65%. They also had to get the votes of all the different states. And then they have to also, I think it's a very complicated process to get the constitution to be reformed. Parties strive to get there, to be able to change it. And if they can't, they call for referendums. And so they can really go around the institutions to annul the institutions themselves. And let me give you this example, this is from Mexico. The former president is called Manuel Andrés López Obrador. He used to be a person from the former ruling party, but then defeated as a position, created a new party that is called Morena, and brought a big transformation in Mexico. He also, like Chavez, came to power because there was a profound dissatisfaction of Mexican voters of what democracy had delivered in Mexico. He gained support of voters, and he stayed there for 6 years. He was able to create a lot of social programs and also govern with a very clear voice in favor of the poor against the elites, very polarizing language, and he was incredibly popular. So in the most recent elections that just happened over the summer, he won with a very huge margin. He could not get reelected, and Claudia Sheinbaum, who is the new president, came to power with that huge landslide that AMLO gave to her. But the Congress took power when still AMLO was in office. And he took that moment, 1 month before he left, to completely change the institution. So one of the big transformations is that he undermined the independence of the judiciary. He was really in fights with the judiciary throughout his period. And what he did is he now created that every single judge, from the lowest judge to the Supreme Court, is going to be popularly elected in Mexico. And obviously with that system that is so dominant, controlled by Morena, everybody is very concerned that this is going to destroy the institutional apparatus of the state. This is a picture of the massive protests that have happened in Mexico, similar to how it happened in Israel when Netanyahu tried to annul the independence of the courts. And unfortunately in Mexico, the regime and Claudia went away along with what AMLO created. And now in the period that she's been in power, there has been like 7-8 constitutional reforms that AMLO promised he was going to pass. So this is the way in which we are worrying today about the future of democracy in Mexico. So I'm going to talk quickly about now the elites. So how do you, so mass support is not the only thing you need to remain in power. This is very important for the reasons that I have mentioned. But also you have to be able to share power with your ruling coalition in some way. So one of the ways in which the literature has argued you share power is maybe by giving them access to the legislature and giving them some policy influence, those rivals that are not in your favor. But I argue that is not really a very credible offer, because in these regimes, the legislators don't really play that of an important role. If you have the supermajority in the Congress or in the Senate, it's very unlikely that you will have any policy influence. So legislators are not really the way to share power in these regimes. Others have argued that the way you do that is by simply giving money to your cronies. And so giving more money, for example, to the military, coup-proofing your system. You give more budgets to the military. Well, you can do that, but in doing that, you really empower the military. So you have to be really careful. That creates a problem of commitment. So how do parties do that? And I have developed some important concept. I'm not going to go here in detail of what this model tells, but in the end, the intuition of this game theoretic model is that the more loyals, you have to convince your friends to invest in your system. Because if you don't convince them to invest in your system of institutions, they are going to be plotting against you, because that's the only way to gain power. So you have to credibly commit as a dictator or an autocrat to share power in some way. And these commitments are really hard to establish in autocratic regimes because institutions are not binding. So you could say, okay, I share power with you by giving this access to the judiciary, but then I annul the judiciary. So how do you do deals that are credible in an autocracy? Is really very difficult to think about it. So the role of the party is really that important in these systems, because the party as a long-lasting organization allows the dictator to give some credible access to power positions to a lot of ambitious and lower middle-level cadre politicians that are able to enter politics and aspire to long-term careers. So it's not going to be through policy influence that you gain power sharing in these regimes, but it's really more through entering the system of power positions that are distributed by the dictator or the autocrat, and this is often done through the party. And one of the implications of this is that regimes with parties are significantly more stable than regimes with the military. So here, for example, this is a survival analysis. So the shorter the line, the closer to the y-axis the line is, the faster a regime falls. So, for example, these are military regimes that more or less on average last for 5-6 years. And military, multi-party and single-party regimes, as you could see, they are very much towards that area of the graph, which means that they are significantly longer lasting. And that's one of the implications of the work. You have mass support, and then you have a party organization that distributes power in that way, and that makes you less dependent on the military to be able to stay in power. The more dependent on the military, the more in danger you are. So these regimes manage to do these two important aspects. And here are just some models that show the the failure rates of military regimes, again, failed very, very rapidly. And then the multi-party and single-party fail less rapidly. Democracies are quite stable, which is good news, although we are experiencing this period of instability. And then I'm going to wrap up with what is really what I believe one of the most important questions. Once you establish yourself in power in this way, how do you get rid of a dictator? So it's really a very challenging process because on the one hand, unlike in democracies where the armed forces are going to be neutral in terms of who wins the elections, that's what they are supposed to be, here the armed forces are not going to be neutral. So they are going to, in general, be in favor of the incumbent and enforce, if the incumbent is willing, enforce electoral rules, fraud against you. Again, they have very large incumbency advantages because they control already the state, with all the patronage that they can distribute. And they have also, normally they control the media or have really diminished it. And importantly, state organs, courts, electoral commissions, prosecutors' offices, which means that in essence, the electoral process is in the hands of the dictator. So they control how the elections are run, and they can very easily make fraud. So this is, again, this is one of the propositions that I make based on game theory of how do you get rid of an autocratic regime. And I just tell you like an anecdote. When I published this paper, I was looking into Venezuela's, I think it was a Venezuelan video of a professor in Venezuela who had tried to make what the intuitions of the game were saying about how to democratize a system, and he had all these like puppets playing each other and what was the lessons of the paper for Venezuela. So I felt proud that what I had written there was informing what Venezuelans were thinking about how to defeat their autocrat. So basically, the intuition is here you have the incumbent, and suppose you have two parties that are competing against the incumbent. So the incumbent can say, okay, I commit fraud. So let's say I'm challenged and I lost, or I just want to inflate my voucher, and I commit electoral fraud, and then I have two challengers. Okay, and so the basic intuition of the game is very simple. To be able to challenge the regime, all opposition has to coordinate to fight against the fraud. So if fraud is committed against one part of the opposition, and the other part of the opposition doesn't coordinate in challenging this fraud, it's going to be very, very hard to unseat this dictator. But that's not the only thing that you need. You need, obviously, voters to be able to mobilize behind you to defend their votes. So these voters, if they mobilize behind you, they are going to pay a risk because protests obviously can be severely repressed. Okay, so the key insights, as I mentioned, is the opposition needs to stand united as a force to defeat the autocrat. When the opposition is divided, and this has happened repeatedly, it's very easy for the autocrat to buy off the opposition with selective incentives. So, for example, I give you seats in the legislature, I give you some access to a cabinet position, and in a way that you divide the opposition that way. So you buy them off, for that way. But let's say that you are able to unite both. Every opposition party unites, and all the parties, all the voters also unite behind to defend fraud. Well, then you have to calculate what the armed forces are going to do. And here, if the risk of the pressures could be really, really steep, such that this unification is not going to bring the dictator down. So what are the key sort of variables that we need to consider, and this is going to be informative to understanding even what is going on in the US today. So the first thing to consider is that when voters are really divided along, for example, ideology, or ethnic or religious lines, it's going to be very hard to do this coordination. Let's say that votes were stolen from the left-wing party and I'm on the right. I might not want to go defend the right. I might still prefer the incumbent than the right coming to power. Or the same if it's an ethnic group that is different from your own. So that is really something that causes problems. So considering that voters are going to evaluate the incumbent and the opposition or a transition to democracy based both on their policy positions, on their ideology, on their ethnic identity, but also on how much you value democracy. So I grew up in Mexico, and when I grew up, there was fraud committed all the time by the incumbent party. And we grew up with this, what we call a regime dimension, so people really disgusted by autocracies and with really strong preferences for bringing democracies, and some didn't really care that much. So that's part of also the ideological positioning of voters, how much you value democracy versus autocracy, how much you value the regime versus not. So this generates these following two types of voters that I've seen repeatedly in my studies. One is what I call radical opposition voters, who are willing to put their ideological differences aside and fight for democracy, because in the end they put a lot of weight on those interests. And then moderate voters who really prefer their identities, their ideology, and are not going to go fight. They are going to stick with their choices. So in the end, the intuition is that the more radical the opposition is, the more likely is that you're going to have this coordination behind the autocracy. So there are a lot of equilibria in this game theoretic model. Unfortunately, there are a lot of things that can happen. So, for example, one of them, as I mentioned, is the collusive autocratic equilibrium. What happens there is that the autocrat is able to divide the opposition by buying parts of the opposition off. So, for example, in 1988, there was a very large fraud committed in Mexico against the left-wing alternative. Then the Cárdenas was the candidate. Everybody knew there had been fraud. They actually shut down the results. They were supposed to be given that night. We were waiting for them, and it took 5 days for the regime to give the results. Everybody knew there was fraud, and there were two important considerations that the right-wing party took not to go and protest with the left-wing party against the fraud. One was that the regime gave them payoffs. So they gave them really strong policy influence in the legislature. The party no longer had the majority to modify the constitution, so the right-wing party thought, I better get in the government than fight in the streets. And then the other is that the threat of coercion was very large. I remember we were protesting in Mexico City, in the downtown, and then years later, in the memoirs of the then president, he said literally that the armed forces had been deployed and they were waiting for the protesters, who we were up there, to repress the protesters. They didn't do that, but the armed forces were there, and obviously party elites knew about this. So they didn't want to risk a massacre of voters, and that was part of the reason that the regime was able to divide the opposition in that way. So this is one of the possible scenarios of the game. The other, which is really interesting, is that the opposition, they know they have these divisions. Well, they can really pre-commit to fight together. And this is a very common way I've seen it happen. So, for example, forming pre-electoral alliances. In Senegal, the opposition had been chronically divided, and to defeat the long-lasting incumbent, they decided to run with a single candidate, and they formed this pre-electoral coalition. And that's the way they defeated the ruling party. When all the opposition was united, the ruling party didn't dare to repress the voters. In that case, protest was not necessarily. That was the same way in which the KANU was defeated in Kenya. But there is obviously another possibility where protest is necessary, and then there is so big sort of demonstrations in the streets that surpass what all the elites expected, and it's so disrupted that parts of the elite decide to defect. So, for example, the armed forces, when they see that there is so mass demonstration in the streets, they literally say, we either cannot kill all these people, either because they literally mean it, or because they don't want to do that, and they switch sides. So the army decides not to follow the incumbent, And this is something that we've seen. For example, the cases of the Orange Revolution in Georgia and the Rose Revolution in Ukraine had some of these elements. Even Supreme Court switched sides and decided not to enforce the incumbent. So finally, there is, I'm going to shorten this. I'm going to go to Maria Corina Machado, because this is something that I want. This is one of the biggest sort of struggles for democracy that is going on in Latin America today. So what happened? Maduro, I told you, with the economies in shambles. Actually, sanctions the U.S. had imposed on the regime, and then the U.S. decided to lift the sanctions on the condition that the opposition could really run against Maduro. And for the first time, the opposition was able to run in a primary election, so that all divisions of the opposition were overcame, and they selected Maria Corina Machado as the candidate. And then the regime decided to forbid her to run for the election, and so she gave the torch to Edmundo González and ran against Chavez in the election, against Maduro in the election. And against all surprises, they were able to mount a massive campaign. As she has explained directly to us, she just talked to us a week ago in Stanford. They even, forbade them to give them gasoline. They were really harassing all the opposition during all the campaign. They were able to put a massive campaign, and in the end, they came up with 60% of the votes versus 30% Maduro. And the reason we know these results is that they were able to create this massive mobilization called the comanditos of all voluntaries that were able to go to all the voting booths. And in the day of the election, they were able to get the copies of all the ballots. So they have direct access of exactly at the moment they were printed, and they were able to get 80% of those that showed that there was impossible Maduro win. So it's more or less 4 million votes that Edmundo González got on top of Maduro. So clearly Maduro lost. Clearly the opposition came together. What has been the response? And this is one of the outcomes in the game. The response has been repression, state terror. They have, for my understanding, now imprisoned more than 3,000 people. She mentioned that they even torture, and they also have been killing children. So Maduro has been able to deter this opposition that has clearly won the election. So that's one of the sad stories about the game of fraud. So I want to end here. So what does the theory that I developed tell us about what is going today? I don't know if you can recognize, obviously, this is the Capitol insurrection in the United States during the 2021 elections. And this is a similar insurrection happening in Brazil in 2023. Both are considered democratic, both very similarly polarized along ideology. The polarization is such that now political scientists refer to as affective polarization. So it's not ideology only, it's really affect that drives one part to believe that the other part is not human, and that is an existential threat that the other part wins power. So this is the type of setting in these two elections. And in both cases, the incumbents claim that they won elections, and that's false. I mean, we know that Trump lost the elections, and we know that Jair Bolsonaro had lost the elections. So their supporters both instigated the Capitol insurrection in both the United States and in Brasilia, with a very similar dynamic, very violent. And what I want to emphasize is the differences between the responses in both regimes. So in the United States, unfortunately, elites in the Republican Party didn't sanction Trump. He has been able to re-elect himself, despite the fact that he violated the basic rules of democracy. Whereas in Brazil, Bolsonaro is barred from running office until 2030. And I just heard, it was yesterday, I think, that there is an indictment against him because of military uprising. So because of plotting a military coup. So this is a very sharp distinction between both nations in the way that they have dealt with the most dangerous threat to democracy that I can think of in any state, which is really an insurrection against democracy. So what does this tell us? As I mentioned, affective polarization and divisions, ideological divisions among the electorate. But the third one is really the lack of information about fraud, and that's part of the game. So when there is no information about fraud, that means that Trump tells his supporters there is fraud, his supporters are going to believe him, right? Voters have no way of knowing exactly whether there is fraud or not. And so, for example, in the case of autocracies that I study, sometimes this uncertainty is so high that voters no longer believe in the legitimacy of the system. And if autocrats know that they can win elections cleanly, and they know that now nobody believes them, there has been cases, for example, in Mexico and even Chavez, of proving the system so much that it is credible. For example, delegating power to an electoral commission that makes it credible for voters that the incumbent actually won the election. So here in the United States, there is no information about fraud, and the incumbents are able to use this lack of information to manipulate it in their favor. So that, in the game, it all increases coordination dilemmas, because on the one hand, you have very high polarization, like in the US, ideological polarization, and lack of information. So both of these things, the three things together could say, okay, either I tolerate the violations of democracy because I don't have information about it. I think that Trump didn't violate democracy, or because for me, the Democrats suppose, no, that's the thinking of a Republican, would be even worse than tolerating this. And so that is what the game tells us. That's the danger of the electoral game. Okay, so to conclude a way forward, I want to end by saying this is a very great article by Professor Barry Weingast. He's a colleague of mine that has this game similar to my electoral fraud game, but talking more about broader concepts of democracy, not only fraud. And in his conclusion, to uphold democracy, there has to be some minor social consensus among in this case, the mass public, but elites as well, about what are the basic values and rules of democracy. So, for example, when Roosevelt wanted to pack the courts, it was the Democratic Party who said no. There was some consensus that that behavior was not possible. And today in the United States, that consensus has been broken. So somebody has to stand there to defend these principles of democracy, both from the masses and the elites. And that's the basic intuition in this article. So if we need some basic social consensus on democracy and the value of upholding democracy, because what that does is when there is these authoritarian violations, then there is going to be people standing to defend against them, right? Either protesting or the elites. So it's essential to work with affective polarization, xenophobia, bigotry, all these language that it's, the food of the day today in democracies. It's very important to really be able to find ways, practical ways of reducing these. I know that social psychologists are working on this in their own spaces, so ways in which we can really put people to dialogue with each other and do not feel that the opposite is, the opponent is really the human and a threat, an existential threat. And lastly, here, victory to democracy requires that democracy delivers. So material concerns, in this case, during Trump's elections, were really critical for him to win the elections. So for some people who say, the hell about democracy, they were worried about inflation, they were worried about jobs, and they thought Trump was going to do better. I think democracy needs to deliver, and that's something that we see around the world, poor delivering democracies that are very vulnerable to these problems. And then finally, I just want to end by saying that international factors are very important. I started by saying how the Cold War polarized the world. Unfortunately, today we have, again, a very sort of a conducive world in which Russia, in which Iran, and in which China are really empowering autocracies. And there are not enough sanctions against autocratic behavior. So, for example, today, And I again want to finish with Maria Corina Machado. The only thing that Venezuela is waiting for, with 60% more of the votes, everybody really supporting Maduro enforcing his fraud through terror and coercion, is that the international community would really come to sanction Maduro and push him out of office. I don't think that's going to happen, but literally that's all they can wait for, and that's exactly what she has conveyed to me a week ago. So I wanted to convey to you this, how important it is to have that support for democracy. And I just, some room for hope, yes. Bangladesh, just, some weeks ago, Botswana, defeated its long-lasting autocrat. Turkey, the latest elections, they seem, hopeful for the opposition. And then again, I'm not going to talk about that. Guatemala is a very hopeful case in which Bernardo Arevalo, a left-wing candidate, very loved by the people, was able to get in office despite the entire opposition of a very, very conservative and violent elite. So I leave my comments here, and thank you very much for listening to all the work.
I suggest that we give the audience, we keep Professor Magaloni busy for another 10 minutes and gives the audience some opportunities to ask questions. So, please. Yes. Itamar, please.
I happened to read a paper about a week ago on Judith Shklar.
Oh, sorry?
Judith Shklar
Yes.
was the Harvard political scientist who wrote a book called Legalism, on how autocratic systems cover themselves with a legal cover. The book did not receive much, it received some attention when it was published, and then more recently, about 20 years later, it became better known. So can you speak to that? Or whether, because I think it's relevant to what you told us.
Rule by law, rule by law, but rule by law. No?
Yeah, so she called it legalism.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
So should I answer that? I think it's a very important concept, and also an obsession of autocrats to legalize and write in laws their actions. It is a very important obsession, and this I have a paper in this book that is by Tom Ginsburg, and it's I think the title is Rule by Law, and it's actually the distinction between rule of law and rule by law. And what I did in that book was to explain how the regime, in the case I was focusing on Mexico in that case, managed to do that. So to legalize everything that they were doing. And one of the key issues they did was this aspect of the Constitution. So every single time a president came to power, they legalized all their actions in the Constitution. And then, of course, they were able to control the courts because they were political appointees in essence. So they were genius at ruling by law, but of course not rule of law, because there were no limits to their power. I think it's a very important concept.
Yes. Hello, thank you very much for this really, really very depressing presentation. I don't know what there is to say. It's a lot of insights and Yes. I would have one question. Sorry, my name is Christoph Gosszony. I come from the University of Osnabrück in Germany. I also read all your books, your book and your paper. My question would be, coming from Hungary and looking at Russia, looking at Venezuela, isn't there kind of a natural trajectory of these electoral democracies to become ever more authoritarian and basically ending up in a dictatorship? I mean, full-blown dictatorship, for example. If I think now of Russia, I think I really wouldn't categorize Russia as an electoral democracy. I mean, it's a full-scale dictatorship. Mm-hmm. And for Hungary, I can say, like in the course of the years, from kind of a broad consensus and popular support, and it is getting ever more manipulative and like cheating, and getting closer to fraud, and starting to use instruments of coercion, of legal intimidation, showing that it can also use criminal force. There's a clear trajectory until there is. So there's maybe at one end, there's only either they get kicked out by the people, or they kind of end up being like completely incompetent, brutal dictatorships. Thank you very much. Maybe I overlook.
No, I think it's, I emphasized a lot Venezuela for that purpose, because it's the evolution of a system in which, during Chavez you could say, okay, it's a dictator. Still he has support, but he put in place all the infrastructure that was necessary then for Maduro to do what he's doing. So, literally, I think that political side, we are not that great at predicting how these regimes would end. So, thinking of, for example, Bangladesh. This is the reason I end up there, because there was literally also no hope there. It was incredibly, it had turned very similar to what you described, and then there is this massive surprise, right? So I'm more hopeful, but of course, Russia seems to be incredibly resilient and beyond electoral autocracy. I agree with you. You are Hungarian, so you know very, very well Fidesz and Orban. So I think that he's more vulnerable than what he thinks, but I don't know. I've seen, what is the new party that emerged, the TISA? Yeah, TISA. So maybe there is some hope there. No? Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Rajko Vukčević, student of Master Program of Official Statistics AMOS here in University of Donja Gorica. We have mentioned a lot of different countries like Venezuela, Mexico, Botswana, and most of them are the part of Latin America or Africa. Mm-hmm. And I would like to take a note to two writers who gained the Nobel Prize in Economy, Acemoglu and Robinson, and they are really emphasizing a lot that the key, let's say, structure of being liberal or being autocratic regime is having a culture and history of institutions. For example, Great Britain, they developed first institutions in 13th century, like Parliament, Magna Carta, Magna Charta, I don't know how to pronounce. What I would like to say is these countries doesn't have a culture of institutions. So what I would like to point out is are Europeans guilty for some reason for that? Because a lot of that, these countries, have been under the repression of Europeans. For example, most African countries gained independence after World War II. Latin America countries gained independence in the, let's say, mid of 19th century, so they didn't have a chance to develop, let's say, institutions. For example, in Europe, Montenegro and Russia are two last countries who gained constitution. We gained in 1905, Russia in 1906. So is there any, let's say, guilty of colonial history and guilty of us Europeans? So I would like to hear that opinion also. Thank you very much.
So I teach as a Molly-Van Robinson to my students, and we discuss a lot of not only the books but the papers, and it's I think it's been an incredible contribution on their part to tell us about how institutions have very long-term legacies, and also to point to the harms of colonialism that you are highlighting. I think their work is really important. There has been a great deal of evolution on the part of this work inspired by them, looking at significant variation even within Latin America or Africa, and how that variation still accounts for important differences. So there are very highly performing democracies in Latin America. For example, Uruguay, Costa Rica, Chile, even Brazil, I showed, I mean, incredibly resilient to a very far right, with a clearly fascist language and behavior, Bolsonaro, right? And even in Africa, you also have cases like, I mentioned Botswana. He had a really long-lasting corrupt party, but was seen as one of the best parties for a while, and with more. So there is significant variation, and the same thing you observe in China. But obviously, they set really this incredible agenda. What really strikes us is how this global trend is hitting even the United States, right? A system that they regard as a place with very strong institutions, and what is going on in the United States today reminds us and scares us is that, in a way, what sustains this equilibria of democracy can be fragile at some point. And I'm reminded of that. I mean, how could you see an insurrection in the U.S. Capitol? No? When would you have imagined? So I still believe that the institutions are resilient, but these processes are concerning, even with good traditions of institutions.
Thank you very much. One last question.
Hi, Professor Magaloni. Thank you for being here today. My name is Peter. I'm a PhD candidate at Tel Aviv University. And my question to you is, there is a quite significant group of scholars and thinkers that would describe some autocracies as being benevolent. Mm-hmm. One big example that they usually bring up is places like Singapore, or, for example, monarchies like the United Arab Emirates. So my question to you is, how would you classify those types of leadership within your framework?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
This is a great question, and we obviously, when we observe China growing as it is growing today, there is also this idea, there is some benevolence to some autocracy. What I would say is that the variation among autocracies it's so huge that these are very few exceptions, no? And so I still believe that democracy is the least worst of governments, but I also am concerned about the low performance of democracies today. So for a different study, I'm looking at support for democracy and trust in Latin America, but in general in the world. And what we observe is a really huge distrust on the part of voters on democracies. And then if you ask them, okay, if a strong leader comes and resolves your problems, would that be okay? So are you willing to sacrifice democracy? And a lot of answers are positive to that. So, for example, Bukele in El Salvador, I don't know if you are aware of that, but he actually came to reduce violence in such a way that with huge violations of human rights, but people are really thankful because they were really, really destroyed by those levels of violence. So I'm concerned by democracies being low performing, but I would not say, okay, I mean, and people then say, okay, let's move to autocracies, and let's remind that autocracies, if you look at the variation in their performance, it is very large. So it depends a lot on, I think it's dangerous for that reason. I mean, if you tell me, okay, everybody would replicate Singapore, okay, if you are in a very low growing country where everybody's poor, well, maybe that's so much better than being poor and really violent place. But the problem is that getting there is very difficult. So that will be my answer. But I do acknowledge that those cases are important to recognize. In fact, talking about Acemoglu and Robinson, they always think that China, they always thought, no, this is not going to last, because it goes against their theory that it has to be a set of institutions that are good. And I think it is really an anomaly within their, until now. So what they would say, okay, it's not going to last. I think that maybe it's an anomaly, and you could really have growth with a country that doesn't have the right set of institutions, right? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. One more? Yes.